Hey, it's Nancy. Before we begin today, I just wanted to let you know that you can listen to Crime Beat early and ad-free on Amazon Music, included with Prime. It was a shocking announcement that made international headlines. One man, a serial killer, was responsible for the murders of 4 young women in the late 70s. Through a technique known as investigative genetic genealogy, investigators broke a decades-old cold case wide open, ultimately confirming through DNA that an American man named Gary Sreri was responsible for the murders of Eva Dvorak, Patsy McQueen, Melissa Rahorick, and Barbara McLean in Calgary. After identifying him as a suspect, police spent months tracking down family, friends, and former associates of Sreri to build a detailed timeline of his movements and try to figure out if he was responsible for other unsolved homicides.
Sreri fled from the U.S. sometime during 1974 after posting bail for a rape charge in California. He lived under the aliases in Calgary in 1976 and 1977 that included, but were not limited to, Willie Blackman and Rex Long. He used at least 9 different aliases during his lifetime.
I'm Nancy Hixt, a senior crime reporter for Global News. Today, on Crime Beat, we look at the life of Gary Sreri and his path of destruction, which included his own family.
I went from being married to a rapist, that's embarrassing enough, to being married to a serial killer. That's horrifying. I kept saying it to myself, saying, this sounds like a bad book.
Through the course of this episode, we'll try and answer the questions: did Gary Sreri's killing spree end in 1977 with the murder of Barbara McLean? Or are there other victims?
I can't help but keep thinking, even to this day, how many do we not know about? I'm almost certain there are more victims.
This is the conclusion of Uncovering a Serial Killer. When I choose stories to share on Crime Beat, I work to push them forward to cover as much new ground as possible. That continues well through the scripting and editing stage of the podcast, which means I have to be open to change. I've been working on this particular story for over a year, and just as I was finalizing what I thought was going to be a 2-part series, I unexpectedly got in contact with several people, which opened me up to a whole new direction. This episode was never in my original plans, but as you know, the story never ends, and it's clear to me I'll likely be revisiting this case in the future. Some of the details made my jaw drop as I uncovered them, and I know family members impacted by the revelations I uncovered felt the same way. I'll get to that shortly, but first, I'm going to take you back to the late 1950s in Los Angeles, California. That's where Gary Sreri's first recorded crimes took place, and where his life as a serial killer began to unfold. This is also when he met his soon-to-be wife, Marilyn.
He was a star actor in the drama group in my high school. He was a star. He was in A Hat Full of Rain, and he actually had someone want him to go to a studio and audition for a part. He was an excellent actor, and he could put on different voices and different... He was an actor. I was dating his best friend, who I was madly in love with because I was a teenage idiot. I was trying to make him jealous, so I went out with Gary, who asked me out, and it wound up where I didn't make anybody jealous. But Gary did what, and sorry, I'm not a doctor, but I know a little bit about this, that narcissists do. I was love bombed with, oh my God, we're going to have a great life. I want to marry you. All this. I mean, I was a kid, sounded good, right out of a book. And so I continued dating him. He was also extremely good looking and popular and intelligent.
They started dating at 16, got engaged in their senior year, and were married by the time they were 18. Marilyn said her hopes and dreams of a fairy tale romance were short-lived.
The guy I knew was funny, smart, nice, popular, and then the guy I married quickly became someone that was barely around. When he was around, he wasn't very nice, would be emotionally and mentally abusive, name-calling, putting me down, saying I wasn't worth anything, stuff like that, usual, behavior. And he would go out a lot. And when I tried to stop him from going out, he didn't beat me up ever, but he shoved, pushed, and let me know I shouldn't go any further.
She said at first it was seemingly small things that changed their relationship.
I was a child and I was not in love, and I was regretting every second of the marriage, but I proceeded to have kids, and there was no professional protection then, and I was kind of stuck. And women that are in that situation are a little bit leery about leaving, don't know what to do about that, don't have the self-esteem to leave. Anyway, he went from being Mr. Wonderful to Mr. Nightmare.
She noticed extreme shifts in his personality depending on the circumstances he was in.
I had a weird feeling about him as a human. It's really hard to describe this because I don't know that anyone that hasn't dealt with someone with his psychopathy would feel this, or someone that you feel is slightly off or not right or even evil. I hate to use that word because it's so dramatic, but there was something wrong, something not right. I always sensed it, but I was too young, immature to really define what it was. I understand what it is now, but at the time, it just was a gut feeling, and it made me feel very uncomfortable and at times a little scared. He was a chameleon. He had many friends. He was funny. Everybody loved him. Let's have Gary over. Oh, yeah. He was a bunch of different people. He was loving, sweet, writing amazing letters, love letters. He was a wonderful, amazing writer. He wrote me letters. He wrote later on his son letters. And then he could be evil, nasty, cold, distant, at times even scary, menacing. I mean, he was more than one person all the time.
Then came illicit substances. Though Marilyn admits she was naive and didn't know exactly what he was doing.
He was doing drugs from about the third year in of the marriage that I can recall. About 62, 63, maybe 64 was the first time I saw the pot, which he told me was oregano because I didn't know what it was. He worked in an Italian restaurant, so that made sense to me, even though it smelled weird. I know he was doing other things because he would brag about doing LSD and other hallucinogens when that time was the 60s, when it was like a big thing to do that. He asked me if I wanted to do it. I said absolutely not. He bought a wide brown leather belt with a very large goldish colored buckle in the middle. Very pretty, very ornate. And I didn't know why he bought it, but he bought it. And when he got home that day, he showed me behind the buckle was a little snap you opened, and there was a compartment where you could put the various substances in there, I guess, for later that you wanted. He had pills in it that I saw. He had something wrapped in tinfoil, little squares, and I don't know for sure. There was various things. LSD, I think, was wrapped in something at the time.
By then, Gary and Marilyn Sreri had several children together, and she said she genuinely tried to make the relationship work.
We did do normal things on occasion. Not many. I think I can count them maybe on one hand. But sometimes he acted like a husband. Sometimes he acted like he was not a bad father. He wasn't abusive to my children in any way. He cared for them in his own Gary way. But yeah, there was a few times where he was normal. He would call his mother to babysit constantly. He did that all the time. He'd call his mom to baby, can you babysit? Can we bring the kids over? He did that all the time.
But then, one day there was a knock on the door. She was pregnant with their fourth child, and on the other side of the door was the police.
There were 3 or 4 of them there, I guess, maybe more in the car out front. They asked for Gary Serreri, and I called him, and he came in the room, and they immediately put his hands behind his back and cuffed him, and they put chains around his legs, which I guess was called shackling, and they told him he was under arrest. And I went, what? And where are you taking him? And I mean, what a wife would say, I guess, if their husband's being arrested in front of you and your little kids. And they said he's being arrested for, I believe they said rape, kidnapping, and sodomy. Those were the 3. There were more charges, but those are the ones they repeated. They said it to him, and he says, I don't know what you're talking about. I didn't do anything. And they took him out of the house. It was just pure shock. And a reaction of a very young person who was in her early 20s at the time, and thinking, how could he have done this? And this doesn't make sense. And I was naive. So some of those charges, I didn't even know what they were. I'll be honest with you.
And so began a whole new chapter in Marilyn's life and their marriage.
I had to go on welfare, which was for me very, very embarrassing. I wasn't raised in a wealthy family, but I was raised in a hardworking family of first-generation Americans, and we believed in working. So it was very hard for me. He went to jail. Eventually, there was a trial that I attended and a meeting at Chino Prison, which was attended by his parents and me. They also drove me to the trial. My parents had nothing whatsoever to do with the criminal proceedings. They didn't like him. They never liked him, didn't want me to marry him. But his parents were the ones that transported me here and there, and even to Atascadero to visit him once.
Atascadero is a mental health facility in California. Gary Serreri spent over a year there from 1966 to 1967, after he was classified as a mentally disordered sex offender. Once released, he went on to offend again and again. Marilyn has a vivid memory of one of the trials she attended. She said that's how she learned that Serreri used one of their son's toys to threaten a victim.
When I was sitting there in the court, where the evidence was a little green squirt gun. And I said, what is my son's squirt gun doing in this trial? Well, that's what he threatened her with. I guess she didn't see that it wasn't a real gun, but he used it, and I think that made me feel sicker than anything else. I mean, I had a 3-year-old kid, and he's using his squirt gun to threaten a woman with her life. What I knew, I heard in the court, he denied everything all the time, never, ever admitted to me or my son, who saw him the last time, and before he died, that he did anything. He said they were all lying. I was told by police on a couple of occasions and in the court that he either picked up people hitchhiking or picked the women up in bars. He did admit to me that he met a woman in a bar, but that was just a friendly conversation. And he said he knew her from the pizza restaurant he worked in, and they were just chatting. Yeah, right. Okay. And then the police or the court said he took them up to these hills and canyons where he would threaten them.
Her husband became a prolific sex offender, and whatever small semblance of a family life they had was gone forever.
He would be in jail, and then he would serve a little bit, and then he'd get out, and then he went to Atascadero for 15 months. Then he came out, and then he went back to jail. He kept getting arrested on different cases, and I would say I spent a lot of time. I visited him in San Quentin. I visited him at Atascadero several times, and then he came home for a while, and then he would be busted again. Out of the entire time, the first, say, 4 years of the marriage, he was not arrested, he was not in jail, but he was hardly ever home. But from about 1965 to 1968, he was probably incarcerated 90% of that time, if not more. And that's how long I was married from 1960. I filed for divorce in, I think, May of 1968. And my divorce was final around the same time a year later in 1969. So we were married legally 9.5 years.
After that, Marilyn tried to cut all contact with Gary Serreri.
I got remarried in 1971 to my second and wonderful husband, who I was married to 46 years. who raised my kids, by the way. My kids, I found out later, did hear his conversations, did speak to him on the phone at his his mother's house, did see letters. They saw a lot more than I did because they would visit the grandparents. I didn't. Then, after I remarried about a year later, he and his mother showed up at my kid's school, and I was appalled because he had no parental rights anymore. He never paid any child support. He relinquished, and here he was at my kid's school, and I was very frightened. And my husband, my current husband, it was a home for lunch. He went down there and convinced Gary's mother had driven him there because Gary didn't have a car. He was obviously back in L.A. from whatever prison he had been in, which I didn't know. He'd been arrested, then he came back, and then they came to the house, and my husband calmed him down, and everything was okay. And about 2 weeks later, he called me and asked me to leave with him and my children, leave my husband, and go with him to Petaluma to a commune. I went, "You're out of your mind. No, thank you. I'm remarried. Goodbye." That was the last time I ever spoke to him. It was on the phone, and he was angry, very angry with me.
As Marilyn mentioned, Sreri did maintain contact with his children.
My name is Richard, and I'm Gary Sreri's youngest biological son.
I first spoke with Richard in April of 2025. At that point, I had been working on this story for 11 months. Since then, we've gone back and forth several times and recorded an interview for this episode. But that very first conversation will always stand out to me because Richard's insight was remarkable. He was only a few years old when his mother filed for divorce from Gary Sreri. But he said his grandmother, Gary Sreri's mother, made sure the children stayed in touch.
As a kid, we would take turns because my grandparents couldn't take all four of us at once. That would be a little overwhelming. So we would take turns visiting them and spending the night for the weekend or whatever with our grandparents. And while there, a couple things would sort of at least get my attention. In my grandmother's den, she had pictures, and there was a couple pictures of Gary. So naturally, I would ask, "Who is that?" And then she would tell me, "That's your father, Gary." And as a kid, I'm like, okay, my dad is somebody else. Tell me about this person a little bit. And she was reluctant to give me much detail, but just say, "Yeah, this is your dad. He lives in Canada or wherever." And that's it. And then occasionally, if while I was there, because she spoke to him frequently, apparently, and I learned this later on, if I was there when they were speaking, she would put me on the phone and let me talk to him. And it would never last for more than maybe 2 minutes because as a young kid, I don't know what to say. You know, here's a voice that's just some adult voice to me. But the connection was, I know this is my quote unquote father. And he would just be like, "Hey, Richard, how are you? Are you behaving for your grandmother?" That kind of conversation. There was no real emotional connection or anything. And then as a kid, I'd want to go out and play or do whatever. And then I'd get off the phone kind of a thing, and they would have their conversation. What I learned is over the years, she would always send him pictures of us, all the kids, so he could see what we looked like. She would tell him about us and how we're doing in school. So he was being kept up to date on us way more than we were on him.
Richard remembers being asked to keep the conversations a secret, something he says he never lived up to. He always told his mother what was going on. Richard said his grandparents also frequently received mail from his biological father.
So there'd be times where a letter would come in from him and she'd be reading it, and then she would share something with me about what's in that letter. And as a kid, again, very curious kid, I would look at the letter and I would look at things like, what's the date on the letter? Where is it from? Like on the postmark and that kind of thing. I remember once on the phone with him, I said, "So where are you at?" And he's like, "Well, I can't tell you." Well, that makes me even more curious when I saw letters then to see where the postmark was, because now I'm curious, why can't you tell me? Where is he at?
Richard said as a child, it didn't make sense that the letters were not signed with his biological father's name, Gary Sreri.
He definitely used aliases wherever he went. There was no question. And looking back now in hindsight, he lived a nomadic lifestyle. He didn't want to be found. He didn't want to be seen, and he didn't want to be known by many people when he lived in places he lived in. I would ask questions like, why is this name Willie Rex Long, for instance? And they would divert. When I say they, either he and or my grandmother, mostly my grandmother, would divert saying, well, he has to where he lives, and wouldn't give me much of a reason. And being a kid, it's easy to distract me. You want some food, you want to go play a game or whatever. So I think they were successful at distracting me a lot on asking those questions.
Richard maintained contact with his biological father through his grandparents during his teenage years. As a young adult, that connection faded away. Even though Richard lost connection to Gary Sreri, he eventually learned about all of the violent crimes committed in the 60s and 70s in California, and how he skipped bail for another charge of rape. This now explained the secrecy of all those years while his biological father was on the run. Years later, despite learning of that horrible history, Richard found himself wanting to learn more about Gary Sreri.
I always had a curiosity because, and I struggled with the curiosity because I didn't want to hurt the feelings of my stepdad, because again, my stepdad's my dad. And I never wanted to make him feel or diminish the role he had as my dad by saying, hey, I'm curious about my biological dad either. So I would talk to him, my stepdad, and say, would it bother you if I was to go see if I can find him and just have a conversation with him? And he was really magnanimous. He was, no, that doesn't bother me. I know who I am. I know my role, and I understand your curiosity. So that gave me the green light that it was okay to even do it. But even as I did, I still communicated with him and my mother all the time about what I was doing. Because if I felt even for a second that they were uncomfortable, I would withdraw and not do it. Because I didn't want to hurt their feelings in doing it. It wasn't that important to me, even with the curiosity, to hurt them in the process.
Through other family members, Richard was able to track down his biological father's girlfriend at the time and discovered they were living in BC.
What I learned, of course, was that he was incarcerated at the time. It's basically what he said. He goes, it's minor charge, domestic disturbance kind of a thing, more of an argument with a little physical altercation. He didn't say it was with a woman or a guy even. And I guess because at the time my curiosity outweighed what had actually happened, I just sort of accepted that.
Richard proceeded to write Gary Sreri in prison.
I started my first letter, which is, I don't want to talk about the past right now. I think we need to start today and see if we can even establish communication and see if we can even get along. And then we can worry about if we want to talk about the gaps in between, kind of a thing, which he agreed to. So the first couple letters were almost odd because it was me asking questions about who he is and what he's done in his life, and him asking questions about me the same way and my children at the time and all that kind of stuff. And it almost seemed too normal. Like there was nothing. And that's when I had to finally say, let's rip off this Band-Aid and have a conversation at least about a little bit about like, why did you run? Kind of a thing. And he was real hesitant about even wanting to broach that subject, but he understood though that he needed to answer the question. And he basically just said he was going to go back to jail and he didn't want to. That was his reason. And I'm like, okay, I'm not going to really pursue that. That makes sense. Even though it's wrong, it made sense. He doesn't want to go to jail. He ran, right or wrong or indifferent. So I left it at that. And because I had no reason to believe there was anything else that had gone on since then, now we're talking, this is decades later, right? So it's like, let's just talk about other things.
And so the relationship grew. Letters went back and forth, and reading the correspondence took Richard back to his childhood, when he would open the mail at his grandparents' home. The letters his biological father had written, including the way they were written, had always stood out to Richard.
His way of writing always struck me as odd. He only writes in capital letters, which I thought was interesting. The other thing that's really interesting is he acted in his letters like he's my dad, like a father dad. And some of the tone would be very disciplinary, or I'm disappointed in you, or tell me more about this. I want to know more because I'm your dad and I should know these things. And I always was turned off by those things, even when I was willingly having conversations with him, because I never felt he earned that knowledge necessarily, unless I chose to give it up. Him asking for it always seemed like that was out of bounds for some reason.
Richard was learning a lot more about the criminal history of his biological father, but he still only knew about the crimes in the 60s and 70s, committed in California when he was a child, and the supposed domestic-related offense that had landed Gary Swery in prison in BC. He had no idea at the time that his biological father had already killed at least 4 young women by then: Eva Dvorak, Patsy McQueen, Melissa Rahorick, and Barbara McLean. He also had no idea that the sentence Gary Swery was serving in BC was in reality for sexual assault and forcible confinement convictions in New Westminster. And so, without that knowledge, and thinking his biological father was reformed and put his violent offenses in the past, the relationship continued.
I went up to Canada because at the time I was living in Spokane, Washington. So I drove up to Canada to visit him. And the jail he was in seemed pretty minimal security kind of situation. I mean, they're walking around. It almost looked more like a rehab facility than a jail. What I associate a jail being with bars and all that kind of thing. You know, this was the visitation room was just a big room with tables where you played cards and did whatever. And the yard area that you can walk out with them was like a yard with normal stuff. It just didn't seem like a prison.
Richard said it was eerie seeing his biological father after all those years.
You're standing before this person who you know biologically is your dad, you know, in that regard, and that there's all these sort of unique similarities in terms of connections. His mom, my grandmother, his dad, my grandfather, you know, his brother's my uncle, kind of a thing. So, and he knows so much more about me than I did him because of my grandmother sharing with him for all those years, all the information. That was also odd too, because he knew way more about me than I knew about him.
It was his first real glimpse at his biological father's personality.
He is one of the most charismatic, convincing, intellectual people I have actually ever encountered in terms of the way he came off. He could walk in probably any room and carry himself regardless of the crowd he was in. Whether they were, you know, somebody talking about ditch digging or somebody talking about, you know, world finance. I think he could manage to be a chameleon and blend in and actually participate in the conversation and literally be perceived by that whoever he's speaking with as this charming, charismatic individual kind of a thing. And it's, again, knowing all the things I know now and looking at that, it's kind of eerie because part of me says, God, what a waste of an intellect, obviously. But at the same time, it's like he utilized that intellect and that charm to coerce people to doing things that became then his victims. And that's horrific.
By 2003, Gary Swery had served his prison sentence in BC. Once completed, he would be arrested under the Immigration Act and deported, as he had spent nearly 30 years in Canada illegally.
In our communications, the topic came up that he was going to be released. And I had just said, do you need somebody to pick you up at that point? And I offered that I would come up there to pick him up. And he said, well, I'm not sure yet because they're going to bring me to the border crossing of BC and Washington. And he said, I don't know if I'm going to be arrested based on his jumping parole or whatever, bail from back in the 70s. So he has been on the run this whole time under the understanding, at least, that if he comes back to the States, he's going to get arrested for that because why would there be a statute of limitations on that? Little did he know until he was brought to that border crossing, which I met him at, by the way, because we figured just in case, that in 1982, I believe it was, there was a statute that ran out and that they were no longer pursuing him. So when they brought him to the border crossing and the U.S. authorities then took custody of him, because they knew he was being dropped off there, they ran him and there was no wants or warrants. So he was let go as a free man at that point.
Gary Sreri told his son he wanted to go to Montana, so they made the drive to Kalispell.
And when we got there, he was like, yeah, this isn't really what I want. But we went through Coeur d'Alene, Idaho to get there on our drive, and he really liked it. He said, could we just go back there? And we did, and he ended up renting a small basement apartment. He was working at a casino in Idaho making sandwiches, which is interesting because back in the 70s, apparently he worked at pizza places and was a cook and all that stuff. So I guess he just went back to something he knew, but everything seemed to be pretty normal. He's just working a job, paying their rent. Everything seemed pretty basic. And I would probably see him maybe once a month. I would go meet, we'd go have like Chinese food or something and just talk about life. So, hey, how's things going? What's going on?
At that time, Richard was living near Spokane, Washington, so not far away from Coeur d'Alene. Eventually, he moved to Arizona, so the in-person visits with his biological father became less frequent, but they still remained in touch. Until that day that he learned the hard truth that Gary Sreri was not, in fact, a changed man at all, and he had not stopped committing horrific crimes.
What I would occasionally do, because I love the Spokane area, Coeur d'Alene, Idaho area and all that, and the lakes, is I would pull up on the internet the local news station in Spokane. And one morning I did, just to see what the latest news was. And on the front page of that website was Gary in his, I think it was yellow jumpsuit for his arrest. And my heart dropped. Literally, I just sank. I was like, oh my God, what's going on? And I proceeded to read the story of what had been alleged happened. And everything just froze in my mind. I was like, oh my God, this is the same person back then is still here. And he's doing it still. All I could think of is, one, how horrible for this person. And two, how many other people are in between. That's all I could think of. And any communication I had with him ended from that point on.
Before I continue, I need to warn you that details of the crime Gary Sreri committed in June of 2008 in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, are violent and disturbing. A 44-year-old woman had gone out for a few drinks. The bartender had offered to call her a cab when a man, whom she didn't know, offered her a ride home. She accepted, but once inside her house, the man tried to kiss her. She pushed him away and went to the bathroom, but he followed her. And when she tried to leave, he grabbed her and pinned her to the ground. He choked, beat, and raped her and threatened to kill her. The attack was only interrupted when the woman's boyfriend arrived home. Once he saw what was happening, he jumped in to help his girlfriend and pulled the man off of her. At that point, the attacker took off and tried to run away. But thanks to her boyfriend and the police, who were quick to respond, Gary Sreri was arrested outside of the victim's house.
It was just absolutely horrific, what I was hearing. And it just, the amount of anger and horror I was feeling at the time I can't even describe it. It was horrible. But this is what I'm reading, and this is what's making me have so much anger now for him. And anger at myself too, I guess, because I let slide then everything from the 70s up until then, when I probably should have thought of other things instead. But maybe because it was just my curiosity of this biological man wanting to know more, I don't know. But I was tormented with all of that for the longest time. But then I reached out to the prosecutor, and when they told me 1 to 2 years was what he was facing, I'm like, that can't be. He can't be ever allowed out. What do you need from me? What can I do? And that's when they were telling me that it's not in their budget to go to California and get microfilm and all this other stuff because it's just too costly, and they're going to have a conviction anyway. So I did. I made it my goal. I went to California. I got the information, provided it to them. They were able to then connect the Canadian thing. That's when I learned, by the way, about what actually happened in Canada when he was serving time. They pursued basically life in prison for him because of the history. They realized this guy has an over 4-decade long history of committing these crimes. And it's a lot easier to make the argument then in their case to say, he's not going to stop if we let him out in a year or two. There's just no way, because he didn't stop all this time. So what he had a come to Jesus moment all of a sudden? No, because clearly he just committed this crime. So they needed to keep him in here, and a jury or a judge, however that ended, convicted him and said 8 years to life.
And as it turned out, it was a life sentence. Gary Sreri died in April of 2011 while incarcerated at Idaho State Prison.
Ironically enough, prior to being sentenced or even arrested, he had had a form of cancer in the soft palate of his mouth. And he had had a surgery or a procedure to treat that. And I believe they thought everything was fine, but apparently while in prison, that flared up again. And I believe that was what actually caused him to die. And from what I was told by the woman that I spoke to at the Rafton prison after he died, that his death was a very painful death. And it's funny because I'm not a person who would normally ever wish any kind of pain on anybody, let alone a death. There was a weird feeling of relief that he didn't get to go peacefully, because he certainly didn't let a lot of people either die and or even survive peacefully.
Richard thought the death closed the book on Gary Sreri, that all of the horrific things he had done had been exposed. But he had no idea his name would come up again when historical homicide investigators reopened several cold cases. In 2023, some 12 years after his biological father died in prison, Richard received a call from the RCMP, wanting to speak to him about Sreri's involvement in several historical homicide investigations.
I immediately was like, whoa, what? This is crazy. But then after about an hour after I got off the phone, there was a part of me that says, I guess this isn't unrealistic. Like, when you think of the violence in what he had been charged with in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, and then everything in his history, the leap to murder isn't too far. Sadly enough, it isn't that far. But yeah, that initial was like, wait a minute. And when they told me it wasn't just one, it was 4 and possibly more, that's a lot to swallow.
You'll recall that once Gary Sreri was identified by Calgary police detectives using investigative genetic genealogy, the RCMP continued on to try and learn more about him. Officers reached out to as many of his family, friends, and associates as they could to try and gain as much insight into his offending, his aliases, and to timeline his movements. Richard was high on that list. When RCMP interviewed him, they asked for a list of fake names his biological father used. He told me that he easily recalled names he saw on letters sent to his family all those years ago.
Well, Dan and Bill Christensen would be 2 of them for sure. Willie Long I saw a lot of, as well as Rex Long.
And this was the jaw-dropping moment I told you about. As he openly shared these names with me, he unknowingly confirmed information that I had come across in the course of digging for this story, but had never been able to verify. So as you can imagine, when he shared this name with me, completely unprompted, I was in shock. The name you just heard from Richard, Bill Christensen, is one I recognize. And if you're a longtime listener to Crime Beat, you might too, because that was the name Kelly Cook's killer used. If you're not familiar with this case, I'll be re-releasing the complete episodes for you to listen to. But for now, here's what you need to know. The Kelly Cook case unfolded in the tiny farming community of Standard, Alberta, a place put on the map by a shocking kidnapping and murder in 1981. Early in the morning of Wednesday, April 22nd, 1981, a man who identified himself as Bill Christensen phoned to ask Kelly Cook to babysit for him that night. Hours later, a car pulled up to the house. Kelly ran out, got in the vehicle, and the car drove away. That was the last time she was seen alive. The days that followed were consumed with frantic searches. Just over 2 months later, Kelly's body was found on the shore of Chin Lake. Her case remains unsolved. Police have also confirmed one of the many places Gary Sreri lived during his time in Canada was the tiny community of Standard. RCMP believe he lived there from 1977 to 1978, 3 years before Kelly was killed. It was enough of a coincidence that police contacted Kelly's family the day before they announced that Gary Sreri was responsible for the murders of Eva Dvorak, Patsy McQueen, Melissa Rahorik, and Barbara McLean. Here's Kelly's sister, Marnie Cathell.
So Mom got a call from the RCMP regarding DNA testing that had linked Gary Sreri to 4 murders that happened in the Calgary area in the late 1970s. Or 1977, I think it was. And but they had called Mom to specifically tell her that he was not responsible for Kelly. And honestly, in 43 years, we'd never received a phone call like that. They said it was hitting the news the following day, and to basically relax about the fact that he was not responsible. Yeah, it's bizarre. And if he lived in Standard in 1977 or 78, he provenly had already killed 4 girls, which I know that they didn't 100% conclude until 2 years ago. But he lived in Standard.
And there are other details, including a sketch of Kelly's killer, that make it hard for her family to believe it's all just a coincidence.
It's eerie how there is resemblance. And I've never seen that with anybody else that maybe has been a suspicion to anybody. There's definitely a likeness there.
However, the RCMP confirmed to me what they told the family. They do not believe Gary Sreri killed Kelly Cook. They maintain there's holdback evidence, perhaps similar to the evidence held back in the case of Eva Dvorak and Patsy McQueen. They say that will eventually help them to identify the killer. Here's RCMP Staff Sergeant Travis McKenzie.
The pattern of criminality that Gary Sreri presented over the course of his life with of course, 8 victims who survived the attack, and of course our 4 victims who didn't, is very different than with Kelly Cook. So when we take a look at the pattern of behavior, number one, all of Sreri's crimes seem to be opportunistic. Whereas the difference with Kelly Cook is there seemed to be a lot of planning and premeditation. Sreri didn't ever take any attempts to hide or conceal his victims, where with Kelly Cook, we do know that significant effort was made to conceal her after her abduction.
But that explanation doesn't sit well with Kelly's family.
I disagree with that. If he wanted the first girl that he phoned, when she told him she wasn't available, he would have hung around and waited for an opportunity or a time that he could take her. But instead, he phoned Kelly that morning and took her that night. Short of grabbing her off the street, that's the only point of it not being an opportunity. 100% it was an opportunity. She's a victim of an opportunity.
Until Kelly's case is solved, her family will always wonder who was responsible. And without the DNA evidence that solved the other 4 cases, they may never know for sure.
Definitely asked regarding DNA, because that is the only way they linked him to these 4 murders. And at that time, he alluded to me that there was no clothing. Kelly's clothing, I don't know. It's lost, it's missing, it's compromised, I don't know. They didn't come right out and tell me that there was no clothing DNA, but did tell me that there was rope involved, which we all know. So my takeaway from that was that there was no DNA.
Staff Sergeant Travis McKenzie confirmed to me they do not appear to have DNA from Kelly's case to compare with Sweary's.
I'm not aware of any actual DNA that has actually ever been recovered on this file. That being said, is there the potential for the existence of DNA to be on some of the exhibits? I can say that we are looking at those actively. It takes time. And one of the reasons why it takes time is we have to do it right, because sometimes we only get one chance to submit an exhibit. If we submit an exhibit when technology doesn't exist and they'll swab that exhibit, it can result in that DNA being completely destroyed. So we are trying to take a look at any area that can be looked at for DNA. I'm hopeful that one day there could be DNA, but right now there isn't.
Gary Sweary's son, Richard, is convinced that his biological father killed Kelly Cook.
When I first interviewed with the Canadian police, so after I had agreed to talk to them, they eventually flew down here and met with me in person and did an interview and got some information from me as well. They had told me about the 4 people they were investigating. Well, before they got here, I had went online and started researching deaths in Canada, because I didn't know at the time before they got here who they were talking about. And I came across the documentary on Hulu about this person and watched the whole documentary on her. And I was convinced from watching it, this is him. This is the one that they're going to talk to me about. And when they came here and they didn't mention her name at first, they were talking about these 4 other victims. I even said, well, what about her? And they said, well, we haven't made the connection yet, is what they told me. I said, I can't imagine why not. He lived there. There's the aliases. Everything about it just adds up. It's like, okay, I understand you're doing your job and you're an investigator and you might look at things slightly different, but if it looks like a duck, it walks like a duck, quacks like a duck, it's got feathers like a duck. How much more of a duck do you need to draw this conclusion? I've seen people on television, on the news, being convicted of things on circumstantial evidence far weaker than what is pointing here. And I'd be hard pressed unless you had some specific DNA evidence at some point that said it wasn't him, right? That would be the only way I'd be convinced it's not him at this point.
Despite Richard's recollection that his biological father used the alias Bill Christensen, the RCMP claims there's no mention of that alias in the Sweary file. And Staff Sergeant McKenzie maintains there's no evidence that connects Sweary to Kelly Cook's murder.
And I'll always be open-minded. I have one of those guys who never say never, but at this point in time, we don't believe that he would be connected to her death.
Could Gary Sweary be responsible for other homicides? The RCMP's lead criminal investigative psychologist, Dr. Matt Logan, believes so. He conducted a posthumous forensic behavioral analysis on Sweary.
I went through documents from back into 1965 that were furnished by agencies down in California, Oregon, Idaho, and so I had documents from some prisons down there. I had documents from the police. And then in Canada, I had documentation from Corrections Service Canada because Sweary was in for 5 years from that New Westminster sexual assault and forcible confinement. So I had that. And then I had interviews of past relationships. So two women specifically whom he'd spent, 12 and 9 years with. So I had some really good interviews to go on
Dr. Logan describes what he does as basically crawling inside the minds of offenders. In this case, he worked to get inside the deceased serial killer's mind to gain insight into who he was and what motivated his predatory behavior.
There were a number of key findings. I think one of the most key findings was his level of psychopathy. I think I've only had 3 people out of about 270 that have scored that high, which means that we know there are certain features this person has, such as lack of empathy, lack of remorse, poor behavioral controls, criminal versatility, pathological lying, need for stimulation, proneness to boredom. All of these features are part of the makeup of the psychopath, and this man had that in spades.
Gary Sreri was known to be clever and high-functioning.
A very savvy individual, even though his IQ was disclosed from an American institution as being medium. So he would have probably, my guess is, from what I know, he probably would have been in the 100 range, more of a medium score in IQ, but very street smart, very savvy. There's a big difference between intelligent quotient and savvy. And this is how I describe him. He was able to manipulate people to do things, to get ID, to get welfare in Canada, even though he was an American citizen. And he used people. He was very much a user of people. I would call him parasitic. Which is another one of the 20 items that we use to diagnose psychopathy, is that parasitic lifestyle.
In his assessment, Dr. Logan found Sreri to be antisocial and focused on his own need for gratification.
That's my opinion of him, is the lone wolf. And I think at times in his life, he was always hunting. To have come up with the convictions and the cases that we know, to come up with a vulnerable person that easily, I would say he probably did a lot of cruising and a lot of hunting for those people.
Dr. Logan said Sreri's level of sexual deviance was alarming.
This man was the kind of the poster boy for a sexual predator. He had way more than 3 or more offenses that included sadism. And one of the elements of sadism for Sreri was his need to humiliate. He would do things to the victims that were very humiliating. And the different part that I didn't expect with him is after he would finish with them, he would actually tell them to get dressed, or in the cases of the women that he actually murdered, he would dress them again, which we don't see that often.
The one question that Dr. Logan said was extremely challenging to answer in this case is why Sreri killed some of his victims while others survived.
I wish I had the answer to that, because it puzzles all of us, right, in this field. Why did he kill this woman, and why did he not kill this woman? And sometimes we look at victimology and we can ascertain that he killed this one because she fought, or he killed this one because she didn't fight. And we try to piece together the pathology, the personality type, what it is that incites this person to go from aggressive and anger to rage and murder. And in this case, we don't have those answers. And I'm convinced that he probably had murder victims south of the border as well. It's just that the Alberta investigators have done such a great job, finding the cases where he was living there, sending the DNA. And if everybody does that, I think we'll have more of a number with this guy.
Once Gary Sreri was confirmed to be responsible for 4 deaths in Alberta, an FBI alert was sent out nationwide in the USA, with a goal of spurring law enforcement agencies with similar unsolved crimes to look at Sreri as a potential suspect. In Canada, historical homicide detectives continue to work through unsolved cases to determine if Sreri is connected to any other murders. Here again is RCMP Staff Sergeant Travis McKenzie.
We're asking the public if you knew him, if you worked with him, if you have any information that could help give us that timeline of where exactly he was throughout Canada during the 1970s and 80s and the 1990s. We want to know that so we can build our investigation, because we do want to identify, are there other victims that we can associate him to, and that we can bring those answers to their families, because no one deserves to be out there not knowing what happened to their loved ones.
Both Eva and Patsy's parents passed away years before DNA confirmed their daughters had been murdered by Gary Sreri. Patsy's sisters, Laura and Lorraine, said it's likely a blessing knowing what they know now.
I don't believe that they would have got any more peace out of this, knowing exactly what happened, because it was too much torture on them to have experienced the fact of losing a daughter and never knowing what had actually happened to her.
To be honest, the day that we found out, it was like burying her all over again.
Yeah.
But after years of speculation, Sandy and Dee said they found some peace in finally knowing the truth.
I'm glad you're doing this with us today, because now we can tell them that they were just typical teenage girls. They didn't deserve that.
He took a piece of all of us when he took her, and that will never heal. That part of it will never heal for any of us. I think the only good thing that came out of this for all the families was that he can no longer hurt anybody else.
I want to thank Patsy and Eva's families for their help as I put this special series together. Thank you to Kelly Cook's family, who continues to trust me with her story. And thank you to Marilyn and Richard, who so openly and kindly shared their experiences with me. I also want to thank all of the other families, loved ones, investigators, and lawyers who have trusted me with their stories for Season 7 of Crime Beat. And thank you for listening. I'm looking forward to coming back next season with many new and important stories. Until then, Crime Beat is written and produced by me, Nancy Hixt, with senior producer Dila Velasquez. Audio editing and sound design is by Rob Johnston. Special thanks to photographer-editor Danny Lantella for his work on this episode. And thank you to Jesse Weisner, our Crime Beat production assistant. And thanks to Chris Bassett, the VP of Network Content, Production and Distribution, and Editorial Standards for Global News. I would love to have you tell a friend about this podcast. There are now 7 seasons of stories you can listen to and share. And please consider rating and reviewing Crime Beat on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. You can find me on Facebook at Nancy Hixt Crime Beat and on Instagram at nancy.hixt. Thanks again for listening. Please join me next time.